I got roped into babysitting again for my sister's 3 kids, but between us, they kind of creep me out. Hey kids, it's me, Auntie Cayenne. I brought Settlers of Catan.
Oh, you. Is that because Mrs. Addison had her identity erased?
I don't think I know Mrs. Addison.
Neither does anyone else now. She was our babysitter, but then something happened on the internet. She lost everything.
Did you kids do that?
I think it would be really hard to prove who did that.
Hey, where's your brother? Where's Tucker?
He's not here.
He's in China.
Yeah, he got a Fulbright grant.
He's 8. He didn't get a grant. Where is he?
He's in China.
The men from Woshing Wo said probably Hong Kong.
Woshing Wo? You sold your brother to a Chinese triad gang?
The man said if he does well in the massage parlor, he could become the first white dragon head someday.
How could you do that?
We were bored.
We hate Tucker.
He's just a little kid. There is something wrong with you guys. You kids have always had some basic human part missing.
Like that one time we drugged you and sold one of your kidneys?
Kind of like... No, not at all like that. I want you to listen to this radio show. It's about our innate morality. And then we have to go get Tucker.
So would we have to give all the opium back?
Yes. And now the guy who used Shock the Monkey as a lullaby, Colin McEnroe. Actually, how much opium is there?
All right, so we are going to be talking about the nature, innateness or lack of innateness of morality. And our operant text for this is Just Babies, The Origins of Good and Evil by Paul Bloom. Paul Bloom is a professor of psychology and cognitive science at Yale University. And also joining us in studio to help us out with a different perspective on it, or maybe the same perspective a lot of the time, Chanel Smith. She's an ordained minister and an assistant professor of New Testament and Christian origins at Hartford Seminary. She's also the mother of 3 children who are much nicer children than the ones you heard in that intro, I think. How could they not be? But Paul Bloom's down in the Yale studios right now. I want to begin with you a lot of, at least the beginnings of this book, and this book goes a lot of different places. But in the beginning, we're talking about when you can begin to detect in the youngest possible infant signs of something like empathy or something even like an understanding of what we would think of as a moral rule, that it's, in an otherwise neutral situation, better to help somebody than to unnecessarily hinder people. But before I have you explain what can be observed about that, I think a lot of people would say, you're talking about consciousness of babies? Babies don't have any consciousness. They're big, selfish blobs. They want food. They want to be changed. That's about it. So respond to that.
It seems crazy to think of babies as these rich, powerful, intellectual minds understanding morality and good and evil, as well as understanding their physical world and their social world. But I think one of the great discoveries of our times in modern psychology is that babies know a lot about the world. They don't start off as blank slates. They aren't meatloafs. They aren't empty-headed. Rather, they come into the world prepared with a rich understanding of how objects work and how people behave. And in some of our own research, we're finding a rich understanding of right and wrong.
So let's give some examples of this. I mean, we have examples of very young babies. These are, 6 months, 10 months old babies watching these animations unfold, which are animations so they won't be kind of loaded up with all kinds of scary imagery. But give us a sense. What do you find about babies? What do you find about how they respond to at least theoretically moral questions?
Well, what we find in our work is that babies at a very young age show empathy and compassion for people who are suffering. They show a sense of right and wrong. They could distinguish good guys from bad guys. And they even show a rudimentary sense of fairness and justice. So I could give an example, of what we do. We do a lot of our experiments. This is done with my wife and my colleague Karen Wynn at Yale. And what we do is we show babies one-act plays. So, for instance, one of the scenes might be a character struggling to get up a hill. Another character gently nudges it upwards. And a third character smacks it down. And then we offer the baby, like a 9-month-old, the 2 characters who behave towards the climber, the helper, the good one, or the hinderer, the bad one. And then we see, who do they reach for? For very young babies, 3-month-olds who can't even reach, we say, who do they look at? Who do they prefer? For toddlers at around 14 months, we could actually ask something a bit more deeper. Who do they want to punish? So we have these characters in front of them with cookies, and we say, take from one of them. and we see who they reach for to take away from. And what we found in this work is, as young as we can test it, babies show an exquisite understanding of right and wrong. They prefer good guys to bad guys. They prefer helpers to hinders. They want to see good guys rewarded, and they really want to see bad guys punished.
Yeah, and that bad guys punish thing is an interesting area. You have one anecdote in there about a very young child watching two puppets, one of whom is doing something that appears to be good, the other one's doing something bad. And at the end of the experiment, kind of in an unscheduled moment, the toddler reaches out, the little baby reaches out and whacks the bad puppet in the head.
It's a very human. It's a very human impulse. I mean, when you see somebody doing something wrong, you want that person punished. And what we find in our babies is, even before they themselves can do the punishing, they like other characters who punish bad guys.
Chanel, you were assenting to this. This rings true either as a pastor, a minister, or as a mother. You know what he's talking about right now.
I'm thinking as a mother right now with my 2-year-old, getting excited and happy when I put my 6-year-old on punishment.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this is something that you saw, Paul, also, that not only do they want punishment, they have ideas about fairness, too. They have ideas about whether they're being treated fairly. And that might be a little bit of what Chanel's talking about as well, that one child is very interested in seeing justice meted out towards another child.
They do. They have an exquisite sense of fairness. They treat individuals differently when they see them acting fairly, like giving a bunch of people each one cookie versus unfairly giving one person two and another one nothing. And when they themselves get a bad deal, they're extremely sensitive to unfair distributions. On the other hand, I mean, I should emphasize this. I think babies have a powerful moral core, but I also think it's sharply limited. And one way it's limited is with regard to fairness. Babies and young children are very sensitive about being treated unfairly. They don't seem to mind when they get an unjust advantage over somebody. They don't mind when there's unfairness when other people are being treated unfairly and they get more than they should.
There are a lot of questions about this, but just before before I ask Chanel one of the questions, for people who are sort of maybe stopped in a moment of puzzlement about this, particularly when we're talking about 6-month-olds and 10-month-old infants, Paul Bloom, what we're talking about sometimes is what you're testing for is which shape or which personage, which individual who's been depicted does the child reach for, or where does the baby maintain his or her gaze for the longest time, right? That's one of the ways you're of measuring interest and approval.
That's right. So if you're interested in babies' emotional reaction to pain and suffering, you look at other things like how they emotionally react when they see somebody's hurt, what they do when they see somebody suffering, and we find empathy and compassion expressed in very young babies. As soon as they're able to move, they will often move to soothe other people, to give away something to help somebody else. But if we're looking at their understanding, we use methods like where they look, what they reach for, what they hand over. And these experiments are complicated. They're difficult to do. We have all sorts of controls, which I'm happy to talk about. But they provide a pretty clear picture of a surprisingly early understanding.
As we go along here, you may have questions if you're listening, or comments if you're listening. We're talking about sort of the origins of moral behavior or of moral instinct. Give us a call, 860-275-7266. Either what do you see in your children, what do you see in life? 860-275-7266. And you may also tweet us at WNPR Colin. Chanel Smith, as a minister, you're heir to a huge tradition of contemplation about this, which has pretty much been all over the map.
Yes.
About whether, in fact, a newborn human is basically totally depraved. That's what Calvinists would say, and they will stay depraved absent some state of grace that's conferred in one way or another, depending on what tradition you're part of. There are other religious traditions that sort of say, no, it's closer maybe to what Paul Bloom is saying, that basically there's something in us. It is, he quotes even the scientist Francis Collins talking about this, that there's something that God puts in us that makes us good. I don't know, talk a little bit about how you parse that whole question.
Well, whether or not there's an innate ability for infants or children to know between good and evil, the first thing I think about is my 2-year-old. For example, when he's done eating, he'll put the plate on the table and then he'll say, I'm done. But if I don't come quick enough, he'll throw the plate on the floor. Mm. But then when I come to him, before I can even open my mouth, he'll say, that not nice? So I'm wondering, does he really know that he's doing something wrong, or is he familiar with what I'm about to say to him? And so is it just out of memory, or is he truly practicing or exercising his moral code?
And it's probably hard to know that. And Paul Bloom, another possibility, of course, is that he thinks that she has violated some kind of moral code by not attending to him quickly enough, and he has doled out what he considers to be the appropriate punishment.
I mean, there are these anecdotes from Charles Darwin, actually, of his young child.
Yes.
And they're very similar to the Chanel story, which is, this intensive focus on other people and often this demandingness, this expectation on the part of very young children that they be treated fairly and treated with respect. And you can see the signs, even in age of 1 and 2, of outrage when these expectations aren't met.
Right.
So
just as we're judging the babies, I think they're judging us.
Well, as we go along here, Paul, one of the things we'll be asking about, I guess, is it's gratifying, it's heartening somewhat to know that there is at least some kind of evidence of a moral wiring, or at least a human innate congenital wiring towards certain senses of right and wrong, good and bad, following good rules as opposed to following bad rules. On the other hand, we look at all of human civilization and all of human history, we see an awful lot of really bad behavior. So this is a profound theological question for Chanel Smith and lots of other people in her profession. And it's a question for you, too, obviously. If we're all so good, how come we don't stay good? And that's, a 400-page answer minimum. But where do we start? Where do you start with the answer to that question?
Well, I'd start in two places. So first, I'd start with what we're born with. And, I'm often asked, are babies naturally good or evil? And my answer is yes. I mean, there are both propensities within us. There's selfish, greedy, brutal propensities, as well as kind, caring, and altruistic ones. The second point I'd make is that although I think we have a moral sense from the very start, it's tragically limited. Babies, our morality is initially very much caught up in an us-them distinction. Babies are to some extent natural-born bigots. They break the world into those people who matter, which start off as their family and friends and continue to be small groups that they belong to. And the idea of that the three of us have, that there's a morality that should apply to all people, that every human life, every sentient being has value, is a modern discovery. It's not part of our genes. And so a lot of the story of how we become good people is a story of how we override and transcend our limited genetic endowment.
Go ahead.
So, Paul, with regard to your comment about infants being naturally born bigots, what do you do with the issue of racism, and how much effect does the environment or in which we are raised or the school environment have an effect on our moral code?
Really interesting chapter in his book called Others, which deals with this. Go ahead, Paul Bloom.
I think that's a terrific question. We know from the very start, as soon as you could test babies, they show preferences. So you have a baby, two people offer the baby a toy. One of them, these are done with Americans, one of them says hello to the baby, the other one speaks in French, says bonjour. They prefer the English speaker. One of them speaks English, the other one speaks English with an accent. They prefer the English speaker without an accent. Language is very important. Now, what if one of these people is white and the other one's black? The answer depends. The youngest children you test don't take race seriously. They notice race, they look longer at people who look like them, but they don't use it as a basis for preference and morality. Apparently, the evidence suggests that race becomes important if and only if children observe that other people treat race seriously. If the race in a community where blacks and whites interact and Hispanics and Asians and nobody makes a deal about it, racism will not emerge. But if they're in a community where all the black kids sit at one table and all the white kids sit at another and there's tension, by around the age of 3 or 4, they'll pick that up and then they'll develop racial biases.
I correct me if I'm getting this wrong, Paul, but one of the things that I noted in that chapter, too, was that even at a much earlier stage of just kind of raw perceptual reaction, it seemed as though children who were, for example, I think the example might have been Ethiopian population in Israel or something, people who were regularly confronted with people of a different race, people who had different racial facial characteristics. If it was sort of part of your life that, if diversity was sort of part of your early perceptions, you are much less likely, as one might expect, to react to it, right?
That's right. So babies prefer the familiar. They prefer listening to their mother's voice than a stranger's voice. They prefer her smell and another smell, and they prefer familiar groups. So white kids, you show them pictures of white babies and black babies and Asian babies, they'll look towards the white babies. But the exception is when babies are themselves raised in a multi-ethnic culture. So the example I give in the book is a study of babies who were from Ethiopia being raised in Israel. And so they have a very diverse ethnic group around them. You show these babies pictures of different people, they don't care. They don't care about color. They're used to multiple colors, and they still break the world into us versus them. Every human does, but you don't have to do it on the basis of how people look.
Although the other part of this, and you cite this in your book, Paul, that the kind of landmark study that I think fit into Brown versus the Board of Education, the studies in which black children under certain circumstances also preferred pictures of white children, right?
That's right. And in fact, the bias, there's a huge literature on unconscious biases, even among adults who, maybe like the three of us, are sort of explicitly non-racist. And the main finding is that whites have a strong pro-white, anti-black bias. But along the lines of the classic studies that led to Brown versus Board of Education, often blacks do too. So often blacks who will show an implicit bias towards whites. And this is true in general. So most people, for instance, have a bias against the elderly. And it turns out even the elderly have a bias against the elderly.
Well, Paul, going back to the blacks having a bias towards whites, I was just going to ask, what about media? Right, because that has to be a great factor, right? Yes, because even with regard to like my son, for example, who's 6 years old, and what he sees on television, if he sees a picture of Jesus for a movie, then he assumes that white is who Jesus is, and that's right. Because of his understanding of who Jesus is, he thinks that white is right, like the good. And also because you have majority of white representation on the media rather than African Americans, especially in a positive, negative light, I think that contributes to it too, especially when you get to ages 3 and 4 and up, as you describe.
I think you're right. I think that media could have powers both bad and good. When I was being raised, I didn't know many black kids, but I saw a lot of black people on TV, and they were all pimps and criminals. Mm-hmm. And that sort of sets up a stereotype in my head and triggers them start mode of thinking. Now a lot of people are making sort of a conscious effort to have counter-stereotypical people in the media, and I think having a black president is sort of thing which certainly can't hurt. But these are ways in which media could enhance and stereotypes and make things worse. I would sort of also argue that media could play a hugely positive role. So some of the great changes in America over the last many years have been attitudes towards blacks by whites and also about gay people by straight people. And there's a lot of evidence that a huge force for this, a huge positive force, has been situation comedies like the Cosby Show, Will and Grace, Modern Family.
Right.
Because these, all of a sudden, in my house, I now have black friends and gay friends who are wonderful, charming, pleasant people. Part of me knows these aren't real; these are actors, but a large part of me treats them as if, wow, they're part of my group. They're people I like.
Right.
And that has a huge effect, I think.
I agree.
I want to grab a call here from Valentina in Hartford. Hi, Valentina.
Hello. I'm calling just because as you spoke, a number of examples of the kind of behavior that your panelists have described. My first child, who was a little boy, when he was 6 months old, if he walked into a room where someone was crying, whether it was a baby or a child or an adult, he would immediately, look at that person and start getting all broken up and start crying himself. Which, as far as examples of empathy, like he would not just cry, but become bothered by the fact that someone else is crying and therefore in pain or uncomfortable.
Right.
And as far as children, how they respond to others being punished, that same boy who now has 3 younger siblings is like the household enforcer and identifier of good, bad, and justice. And gets really excited as far as, identifying who's doing what they're supposed to be doing, who's not doing what they're supposed to be doing, are they going to be punished, what's the punishment going to be, can we talk about the punishment, and I'm not, my explanation for that is that that's, sort of how he organizes the world, and so of course he's excited about it, but, to offset all that organization is our youngest, who is 2 years old and gets a lot more leeway, obviously, because they're younger and there's a lot they don't understand yet. And when I throw that into the equation of the other 3 kids who are old enough to be beyond a certain point, it's when they see the 2-year-old doing things and getting away with things that they can't, or doing things they're not supposed to, it's kind of like, well, why do I even bother trying? Let's all be, 2-year-old.
Sounds like my household.
All right. So there's a lot there in Valentina's call. Thanks so much for that call. One of the places the call makes us want to go is into the area of empathy, a great area of interest for Paul Bloom, a great area of interest for President Obama, a great area of interest for pastors and theologians. So why don't we take a break, because this is going to be a big chunk we're going to break off. We'll talk about empathy when we get back. So now we're going to talk a little bit about empathy. By the way, our number as we go along here is 860-275-7266. Your phone calls are welcome, 860-275-7266. Paul Bloom is professor of psychology and cognitive science at Yale, author most recently of Just Babies, The Origins of Good and Evil. With me in the studio, Chanel Smith, an ordained minister and assistant professor of New Testament and Christian origins at Hartford Seminary. We were talking, we took a call from Valentina towards the end of that first segment. She was talking about a little child who would naturally cry if she heard or he heard other children crying. It sounds a little bit like empathy. This is something we talk about a lot. And in many respects, as we go into this next segment, I can hear some of you thinking, well, how important is this ultimately to sort of figure out what's innate, what's not, if in fact we know that we become ultimately a lot more complex, both morally and immorally. But, and I'm going to offer up a couple of quotes that are very familiar to Paul Bloom. President Obama, writing back to a child who wrote to him, said, "If you don't already know what it means, I want you to look up the word empathy in the dictionary. I believe we don't have enough empathy in our own world today, and it's up to your generation to change that." Speaking to a commencement group at Xavier University a few years before that, he talked about the importance of being able to, quote, see the world through the eyes of those who are different from us. The child who's hungry, the steel worker who's been laid off, the family who lost the entire life they built together when the storm came to town. When you think like this, when you choose to broaden your ambit of concern and empathize with the plight of others, whether they are close friends or distant strangers, it becomes harder not to act, harder not to help. Paul Bloom, this is a conversation we have all the time. We're having it right now about healthcare in this country. If you have great healthcare, if you have adequate health insurance to meet all your needs, then you have perhaps a less of an obvious incentive to see healthcare extended to all kinds of other people, unless you care about those other people, even though their lives don't affect yours. This is a fundamental question of empathy. So the first question we have for you, obviously, is at the end of the cognitive science end of this, is empathy really hardwired into us? Is this one of the things you see in babies?
It is. You find empathetic responses to the suffering of other people, as your caller gave examples of, from the very start. If you want to make a baby cry, one way to do so is show it other crying babies, or show it somebody in pain. The impulse to put yourself in other shoes, feel what they feel, is a powerful one. It shows up possibly in other species, in other primates, and other animals, and it certainly shows up in humans. I'd also add, I think it's overrated. I think that empathy has serious limits when it comes to morality, and often to be a good person, to be a compassionate and loving person who wants to make the world better, we have to shut off our empathy and focus on other things.
Elaborate on that, because people might find that statement confusing.
Well, empathy is as Obama defined it very nicely, it's putting yourself in other people's shoes and feeling their pain. The problem is that we much more naturally do this for people who look like us than who look strange. It's very hard to feel empathetic for a homeless person or somebody who's disgusting. It's hard to feel empathy for somebody of a different race, somebody who's unattractive. And also, it skews our moral decisions towards helping the one and ignoring the suffering of the many. So it's because of empathy that our government and many people care a lot more about a little girl stuck in a well than they do about climate change. A little girl stuck in a well is a person and still triggers empathy. While broader problems like climate change, which could affect millions, are abstract and statistical and don't ring our emotional bells. I think to be good people, often we have to say, look, let's put aside our gut feelings, our empathetic concerns, and ask ourselves, what could we do to make things better for the most people?
So, Chanel Smith, we're talking a little bit about a term within theology, sometimes called agape. I'll let you define it. I floundered through Professor Autke's class at Yale Div School, and I probably never did quite understand agape. But ideally, what are we talking about when we say that word?
When I think of the word agape, I'm thinking of like a divine love, like a love. And I know, Paul, you talked about not things being from the gut, but it's almost from the gut that you feel for the person. I think that it goes along with what empathy is, putting yourself in the another person's shoes. But I think in your comments, one of the questions that came up to me was, does empathy impede our moral decisions, or are they related? Because from hearing you speak, it sounds as if someone is moved by emotion or really impassioned by someone's plight, that it might prevent them from making the right choice on other matters, such as climate change.
That's right.
But can they not work hand in hand, or are you giving us two different scenarios?
I feel a trolley experiment moment coming here. So there are all these different reticulations of this trolley experiment. But Paul Bloom, it's relevant here, right? The trolley experiment often involves doing something to one person in order to save 5 people. And you get into what our wiring is in that situation.
So the classic experiment, it's Philosophy 101, everybody loves these trolley problems, is there's a runaway trolley and we'll kill 5 people if you do nothing. But if you throw a switch, it will divert the trolley onto a different track and kill 1. And most people think, yeah, that's probably the right thing to do. Then the alternative situation is there's a runaway trolley, it will kill 5 people, and you're standing on a bridge, and next to you is a large man. And if you shove him, he'll land in front of the trolley and stop it cold, killing 1 and saving 5. Now, from a sort of abstract position, these are one and the same, but people feel very differently towards them. The act of pushing somebody, putting your hands on them and shoving, is viscerally unpleasant. It triggers our empathy, and we don't want to do it. And this is used by people like the neuroscientist Joshua Green to point out that our morality involves 2 parts, a rational deliberation system and an empathetic system. And very often our empathetic system could override our reason. I think this is sort of an artificial example and of interest sort of for philosophers, but I could give examples of many real-world cases where our empathy causes untold suffering, and they really are in opposition.
Give a real-world example.
There was an article in Slate recently called Don't Give to Child Beggars, and it pointed out that giving child beggars in Africa and India, their kids in horrible, they're mutilated, they're suffering, and people often give them money or food or toys or trinkets. And by doing so, they're supporting an industry that enslaves tens of thousands of children, mutilates and maims them, and keeps afloat by the money you're giving to them. If you want to help these kids, if you really care about them, don't let your empathy trigger this sort of handing over some money to the kid. Rather, give money to one of many aid organizations that seek to hit the problem at its roots. But there's something we want to help that kid, and we're often very blind to the consequences of our helping.
Although I wanted to sort of veer into the path of the theology trolley for a moment and talk about that, because Chanel Smith, I'm assuming one of the things that you might argue is, yes, from a starkly rationalistic point of view, what you're saying, Paul Bloom, makes sense. I'm now putting all kinds of words in your mouth, but that's all right. You can reject them at your leisure. On the other hand, within the world of theology, we understand that perhaps the act of giving a coin to a child is a good thing. It's a good thing for the giver. It means at that moment the giver has recognized that there's something wrong, and there might be something that he or she could do to correct that, and that it doesn't necessarily preclude giving some money to Doctors Without Borders later on or to some group like that, but that there's a fundamental value in acknowledging one's own empathic instincts.
Right, I would agree. Yes, there is something that drives us to do something good for someone, and empathy kicks in. But I also think that there's something called common sense that goes along with it. So, for example, I'm from Jersey, and same example, if I see a homeless person on the street, in the streets of Newark, and they're asking for money. Now, of course, I'm going down my Rolodex, looking at the person. Of course, we have all our stereotypes saying, well, this person is on drugs. They're going to go and score something or whatever. Or I can take the same money, instead of putting it into his hand, go and buy him a meal. It's the same thing, but I'm choosing how I think will best benefit him. Instead of possibly feeding an addiction or something, I'm still helping. So I think that empathy can still be joined with rationalization by choosing how we're going to help that person.
And Paul Bloom, just for the sake of a conversation about this too, my mind is flashing over to Herb Caen, who was a columnist for many, many years for the San Francisco Chronicle. And San Francisco kind of famously has this sort of gigantic population of people who are out there panhandling. And what Herb Caen would do was he would leave the house every day with at least one roll of quarters in his pocket, and with the idea that he would give a quarter. This is probably a couple of decades ago. A quarter was worth a little bit more than it is now. But and I think part of his rationale too was, well, I'll at least be in touch with that person enough to have given them a quarter. It's not going to save their life. I'm not even going to bother like Chanel to go take them and buy them a hot meal because they probably don't want that anyway. They want something else. They want to buy something else with their quarter. But at least we'll be two human beings in communion with one another. Whereas if I gave them some kind of steely rationale, that in fact, instead of giving you a quarter or anything, I actually do give to this other organization, which in a much more systemic way addresses the problems that have put you here in the Tenderloin, hustling me for money, that some fundamental human thing gets lost right there.
I think it depends what you want. So you're right. Giving money to the homeless person or to the child beggar gives us a satisfying click of happiness. We've done something good. We feel better about ourselves. We feel warm in a way that putting our credit card info into the web for an Oxfam donation doesn't. Right. So if you want that, that's how to get it. Those personal interactions. On the other hand, you may want to make the child's life or the homeless person's life better. Then you would do something else. And so I would hope in some way that sort of a mature theology would go beyond the sort of personal satisfaction of the act and ask yourself, what's the broader good?
Well, see, I think that's a matter of perception, whether or not you're doing good for someone because you're trying to make yourself happy, or if you're saying, I can help this person right now, or I can give to a cause, and then eventually it'll trickle down and be able to affect this person in a positive way. So I guess I disagree that I don't look at it as having this moment of satisfaction or happiness for myself or for that individual who chooses to help someone in that moment rather than donating or clicking. And yes, it does seem, impersonal when you're just putting your credit card number in there. But there, you not necessarily have to look at it as just a personal right now satisfaction, but how can I help this person in the moment rather than making them continue to suffer until whatever cause you're donating to can get to that individual.
I want to just switch trolley tracks here, just because if we get too bogged down in this, there's all kinds of other things in Paul Bloom's book, which is called Just Babies, The Origins of Good and Evil, that we'll miss doing. I want to just swing over to kind of a different area, though not an unrelated area. That one of the questions that we have here is how people do decide what strikes them as fundamentally right and what is fundamentally wrong. Now, giving money to people who are in need, it's maybe a little bit easier to understand our own sets of perceptions, but there are more complicated ones. And just for the sake of this, of having something to talk about, let's pick homosexuality and gay marriage and things like that. All right. So we know that the country is easily convulsed by a debate about these things, and that people come to radically different conclusions simply by, they think anyway, searching their own souls about it. They search their own souls in some cases, and they run into what Leon Kass says is the sort of the reality of repugnance, that they just know sexuality is wrong. Yes, they can also find some scriptural basis for this, but also something else is telling them that homosexuality is wrong. You're just not supposed to do it. And Leon Kass might look at Paul Bloom's work and say, see, there must be some way in which we're wired to reject that because it bothers so many people at such a fundamental level. On the other side, we have people who say, no, this is more, some of it's at least experiential. If you grow up around people, around gay couples, if you know a lot of gay couples, which is truer and truer for the generation of children today, they will know gay couples. They will know people who are in happy, fulfilling-looking gay relationships. So it seems normative. It's less likely to excite feelings of repugnance or disgust. So I'm going to ask both of you to talk a little bit about how we arrive at moral conclusions about this. One moral conclusion is everybody ought to have the chance to love whoever they want to love, and people are different in how they make those choices, and we should affirm those choices. The other conclusion is certain things are wrong. We just know they're wrong. So, Paul Bloom, talk a little bit about this. You parse this particular question up to and including the thoughts of Leon Kass in your book. Where do you come out on this?
So I'm a huge fan of coming to moral decisions through rational deliberation, through reason, through argument and thinking of examples and asking yourself, what will make the world a better place? And a large part of my book is arguing that the capacity to do that is part of our natures. And this is one of the explanations for why the world has in so many ways gotten so much better. But there are other things at work too, and one of them is the emotion of disgust. So Kass is correct. We have evolved this emotion. I think we've evolved it to keep us away from parasites and poisons, to keep us from eating feces and urine and rotten meat. But it extends to people. We naturally find people disgusting. Disgust has been used as a motivation for genocide, for racism, for all sorts of evil acts. And it is very easy, sadly, to get people to feel disgusted towards a group. And I think that the world would be a much better place if the emotion of disgust was removed from our brains. But you're also right in what you said, which is you can grow up in a culture where you don't feel disgust towards the group. Our attitudes towards homosexuality consists of one example. Another one is interracial marriage. 20 years ago, and we're all old enough we were around 20 years ago, the majority of Americans thought interracial marriage was morally wrong. And we thought it was wrong because people thought it was viscerally disgusting. And that's a case study of how our reason and rationality and moral progress can override our instinctive disgust responses.
All right. I want to come back to that, particularly with Chanel Smith, and particularly the sort of whole question of moral authority, I think, kicks in here. But before that, just because we're about to lose him, he's got to go do something if I don't take him right now. So, Michael from Madison, turn down your radio if you've got it going. And quickly, we want to hear your comments because we know you have to depart.
Okay.
So what have you got for us? You're on the air right now.
Oh, I'm on the air right now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me take you off speakerphone and just...
Please do.
So, the question I had was, this idea of right or wrong, good and bad, it seems to me like it's the idea of what is right or wrong or good or bad, or the words evil. These seem to be more accurately maybe described as constructs of the human brain, that they may not exist independent of our brains in an objective reality, but more likely are the result of millions of years of evolution, and that perhaps it would be more accurate to think of them in terms of what is social, pro-social, or antisocial. Then I wonder what you might think about that.
I happen to know Paul Bloom has a lot to say about that, and I will try to swing back to that. Obviously, there's an evolutionary argument here that societies that are capable of taking care of one another, of exercising empathy at certain times, of exercising many of the moral qualities we're talking about here today, are more likely to survive than societies that can't do that. That may be part of the evolutionary argument you're talking about. What I want to do is take a break. I want to come back to this whole question of sort of how we decide where our moral impulses go. Maybe go back to the questions of interracial marriage or gay marriage or homosexuality, and hear a more theological perspective from Chanel Smith about this when we come back.
Maybe the bad, bad thing. Maybe the bad, bad thing. Maybe the bad, bad thing. Maybe the bad, bad thing.
Today's show was produced by me. I produced it. I hope you're all enjoying it. Actually, Betsy Kaplan did most of the work. Why did I say what I said? Why do I feel the need to lie and inflate my own value while I degrade the people that I really care about? I don't know. It just feels so right. Our intern today is Garrett Connolly. The part of Bill Curry was played by George Costanza. Tomorrow on The Nose, a white supremacist finds out he's part African-American. And now, back to Colin.
Yeah, there's a bit about that particular story in the news this week that also touches on Paul Bloom's book. But I want to go over to Chanel Smith, who's here with us from Hartford Seminary. We just heard sort of one set of descriptions, and it kind of feeds into the last call that we took too. So, Immanuel Kant would say, well, no, there actually are sort of, innate things that we do understand. There are moral imperatives that exist independently of man. And this country is kind of basically founded on the Lockean hypothesis that man was capable of recognizing natural laws. And despite what authority figures tell you, despite whatever has been the existing authority for centuries, it doesn't matter. A human being can figure out what's right, what's wrong, how a human being ought to live. And then within religion, we have all kinds of traditions coming at us, and people who try to figure out, well, is homosexuality okay or not? One of the things they might do is look at Scripture and try to draw something from that, or probe their own selves in a very Lockean way, try to figure out if they can tell somehow what's right or wrong. So as somebody who's an ordained minister, how do you help people sort something like that out?
There are so many ways to enter your question. I think just going back to what Paul was talking about the emotion of disgust, I'm wondering if we can look at it a different way. I mean, it's definitely connected to the creation of the other, someone who doesn't look like me, someone who doesn't subscribe to my ideas or what my religion is, and what the ideas about, for example, homosexuality is the other, and they are. It's threatening. We feel nervous. So we have to castigate them and make them vile. Evil, something that we don't want to be like. But then the bigger question to me is, who gets to make that standard? Where does authority come from? If there are religious organizations who say that homosexuality is wrong, to which scriptures do they subscribe to? Probably Romans, where, it says God gave them over to their own passions. But there are also other scriptures that you can say, judge not. Do not judge others. So I think the big question is, does one need religion to be moral? My answer is no. There are a lot of people who do not believe in God, but are able to make or if we're defining morality as the ability to decide between right and wrong. However, the biblical text has also been used to support one's moral cause or one's agenda, right or wrong. So whether or not there's something innate in us, yes, I do believe that we have the ability to use our rationality to make decisions. But I also think that there's this such thing as, if you want to call it peer pressure, or, what is my collective group or my family home or my church congregation or religious community going to say about my decision. And even I agree with what you said, Colin, about homosexuality, whether or not you're raised in a home where you see a homosexual couple and you're not afraid by it. It's the norm. Rather, someone who is either hearing that it's wrong or doesn't know about it, their first thing is a defense to protect myself from something that is not customary, something that is not standard. But I think all of this through education about homosexuality, or even talking to someone, I don't even think it's a huge issue. It's not something that we should use to set someone apart or to say that they're different. Although
there's plenty of argument for the idea that we have kind of a natural inclination to identify others, as to
right.
and to break up into coalitions and teams. Paul Bloom, we're going to run out of time here pretty fast, and I can't believe how fast this has gone by. There's so many things I want to talk about, but I want to ask you, particularly because Chanel just got through talking, how you see your work interacting with the humanities. I mean, for centuries, this kind of thinking, this thinking about where moral imperatives come from, was the work of philosophers and theologians. And so it's Kant. And your book is peppered with references to Kant, to Hobbes, to Augustine, to Aristotle. But you're also part of this so-called affective revolution, that's affective with an A, in cognitive neuroscience and psychology, at least to the extent that there's this vanguard looking to substitute, maybe not substitute, empirical research for, I don't know, philosophical and theological pondering, whatever philosophers and theologians do, that there's information that can come out of double-blind studies and cranial MRIs and all kinds of other stuff that makes up a body of knowledge that could, in fact, sort of crowd out the humanities a little bit. I mean, do you see this as interactive, or do you see the kinds of truths that you're developing as things that can substitute themselves for theology and for philosophy?
Yeah, a friend of mine once described the sort of work I do and its relationship to the humanities as an attempt at a hostile takeover, and that is not my sentiment. I think that there's particularly from a philosophical standpoint, I think philosophy and theology and other domains of humanities interact very nicely with this new revolution in cognitive science and developmental psychology. I'm not a moral relativist. I think that your caller was correct, that our beliefs about good and evil in the end rest on facts about how our brains are wired and how we evolved. But that doesn't mean that they aren't true, that there aren't some ways of acting which make the world better and other ways which make the world worse. And so I think, if anything, philosophy and the humanities more generally will be enhanced and enriched by an understanding of our moral lives, our moral natures. Too much of humanities, I think, has bought into the idea that humans are blank slates. We start off knowing nothing in this old culture. And I think that they could learn a lot and can benefit from the insights we're getting from, baby labs, among other things.
Mm-hmm. All right, let me grab a call from Carrie. We are going to run out of time here. I want to apologize for all the rocks that we didn't turn over and look under because there's so many of them that we're not going to get to. But here's Carrie in Newington. Hi.
Hey, I just wanted to comment. I have two children who came out hardwired vastly different for their sense of good and bad. And when my younger daughter was 4, she was trying to explain to the 8-year-old who was angry at her for watching a show that had bad guys that you have to have bad guys to have good guys, or the guys couldn't fight against anybody.
That's very theologically sophisticated. I think it's true. There are individual differences. We've been talking a lot about cultural and environmental differences, but to some extent people come out wired with different degrees of compassion and empathy, interest in others, interest in morality in general. But I think that there's nobody who's so far gone that the right environment can't turn him into a good person.
And maybe nobody who's so far good that a bad environment can turn them. I mean, one of the things that you do rather gallantly, Paul Bloom, is rehabilitate the reputation of your predecessor, Stanley Milgram, with this thing in your book about how he left letters around and people would pick them up in public places and go mail them, even though there was no real gain for them in doing this. But Milgram is more famous for this experiment in which he just took average people, put them in the presence of somebody who at least quasi appeared to have some kind of authority, some kind of reason for making them do things, and then people did what appeared to be appalling things, just horrible things, administering terrible shocks, or what appeared to be terrible shocks on other subjects, even to the point of lethality, which suggested, boy, it didn't take much to take an outwardly moral, even-keeled person and turn him into a monster.
I think that's true. I think you could have a certain environment that could bring out the worst in people. But I'll tell you something else about the Milgram study. Not everybody did it. Mm-hmm. There's a proportion of people who said, I'm not going to harm this guy. I'm walking out. I'm not going to listen to you. Just like there's people who I think have the potential to be evil, even in the best of environments, there are people who will be good and moral and decent, even under the worst of circumstances.
Yeah, and there is, you've seen the film, there are people who are weeping as they're doing this. They're doing horrible things. They are weeping. Their hands are shaking. They're fumbling for cigarettes. They can't believe that they're doing these things. But they are doing these horrible things. And it was part of a whole series of moral questions post-World War II. What did it take to get large populations of people just to do really awful stuff? And so Chanel Smith, we're pretty much out of time. And, Woody Allen used to use end his monologues by saying, I'd like to end with a positive message, but I don't have one. Would you take 2 negative messages? But Chanel Smith, since you're the pastor here, lead us out of this wilderness. You got about 60 seconds to wrap this up on what would ideally be a hopeful and uplifting note.
If now that I have everyone's attention, I would really just want to encourage everyone to be the best you. One of my mentors, the Reverend Dr. Cheryl Kirk Dugan, African-American theologian, says when you make a mistake, yes, you can repent about it, not saying you have to go to a priest or anything, but be repentant and within yourself and then make the next right decision. So I think I would end on that.
That's a great place to end. The book that we've been talking about is Just Babies, The Origins of Good and Evil by Paul Bloom. There's a lot in it that we just didn't even get close to. There's so much more to talk about. I wish we had more time. I do thank both of our guests, though, Chanel Smith, an ordained minister and assistant professor of New Testament and Christian Origins at Hartford Seminary, and Paul Bloom, professor of psychology at Yale University. Once again, author of Just Babies, The Origins of Good and Evil. One of the promos that I heard during the show suggested they may have scooped Radiolab. I don't think that happens very often, so I'm excited about that. We'll be back tomorrow with a nose.
In the middle, clap your hands up. In the middle, everybody knows. knows. Everybody knows. Everybody knows. Everybody knows. If it's right, it feels alright. And if it's wrong, you know it's wrong.
I'm Kyone Wolf. Why are you so cute? Why are you so cute? What did you call me? Are you serious? Babies can beat